We'll get started every time. Welcome, everyone. We will get started shortly. I am not Kathleen Meal, but I will be stepping in today. Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Exploring the Arctic. And thank you to everyone watching the recording on YouTube. Today, we're joined by Dr. Susana Hancock, a polar expert with the IPCC and climate researcher with Arctic Basecamp and the Greenland Project. Susana is quite literally someone who goes to the ends of the earth to save the climate. Every year, Susana clicks into her skis and crisscrosses some of the world's most vulnerable ecosystems, the ice caps. The poles currently harbor 9 of the top 16 climate tipping points, and Susana is particularly interested in understanding the cascading planet-wide impacts of some of the most pressing ones. When not on the ice, she works with global leaders, heads of states, and decision makers to understand the multiplication of polar-driven climate risk on communities worldwide. And we're also blessed that she lives here in Maine. Today, she's here to spend some time working with us. I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Susana today. She will share some of her stories of adventure and adrenaline behind her work that is currently impacting global climate policy. But first, my name is Will Sedlak. I am not Kathleen Meal. I'm the political director at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting the environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of these goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive into today's program. We will hear from Susana first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You do not have to wait, though. Please send your questions to me, Will Sedlak, through the chat as they occur to you. I'll compile all the questions, synthesize those with similar themes, and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. We ask that you not message Susana directly, as we want her focus on the presentation and not her chat box. Please message Maggie Summers if you have any technical difficulties. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon for you to share with all your friends. You can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns on YouTube, where a number of playlists can help you focus in on particular topics. Thank you all for joining us. And Susana, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Will. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Maggie and Maine Conservation Voters and everyone who's here. Some names that are fun to recognize from past lives and foreign places and similar polar people. So thank you all for joining. I will quickly share my screen. Get started. So hopefully you can all share my screen, and I asked Maggie to surprise me with the title, and she chose Exploring the Arctic. So that's what I'll be talking a little bit about. So I guess I'll start a little bit about why the Arctic. And the Arctic, for me, I don't really know how long it's been a passion of mine, except that there's this picture of me on the screen right now when I was about 5 years old in kindergarten with my little sister. And that picture was taken, not that you can tell from this, but at Admiral Peary's summer house in Casco Bay. And Steph and I used to go there in summer evenings. And although I didn't really understand anything about eugenics and other practices of early polar and other scientific expeditions, I fell in love with photographs and journals about the North. And so that was definitely an early influence of mine. Other pictures here are right below it. I'm on Polar Bear Watch there about 2 years ago. Center picture is traversing northern Svalbard, then moving to the left, speaking at the UN Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt last year, and then a picture from my undergrad. I was doing some glaciology measurements in Iceland, and that was sort of my first possible real field experience in the Arctic. But why is the Arctic so exciting for me? And I think the big reason that it's so exciting is that it is basically a command center for the global climate, yet it also feels like it's removed, at least in my experience growing up at, you know, about 45 degrees north, halfway between the equator and the North Pole, and yet realizing that the Arctic has direct influence over me right here and my friends and family. So we have what we call tipping points, and these are 16 main tipping points on your screen right here, and these are climate tipping points. So that means that they are systems that can be set into process and set into change, and they are changing, but they can be pushed past a threshold in which that change becomes irreversible. And not only that, but that change compounds and it cascades, setting off other tipping points or changing other planetary systems. So of these 16, 9 of them are in the polar regions. And then 5 of those 9, 6 overall, are set to tip even within the space of the Paris Agreement. And we had our first taste of a 1.5 degree world this summer. We had record-breaking wildfires, you know, Greece having Europe's largest wildfire. By mid-September, Canada had already burnt more than 600 times what it would average, its acreage it would burn on an average, in an average season. South, the warming of the Atlantic Ocean, I mean, the hot tub temperatures we were getting around Florida, all over. So seeing these, you know, what this 1.5, really understanding that that's not necessarily a safe space for humanity. But these tipping points, for example, if we lose permafrost thaw, for example, so we have here boreal permafrost collapse and thaw. If we were to lose that, that could eat up 40% of our carbon budget. We don't even talk about that. We're having negotiations on carbon budgets. The loss of Arctic sea ice and snow could eat again up to 40%, or exacerbate global warming by 40%. So again, you know, these are little things that have huge global consequences. We see these effects around the world, not just in fires, but extreme weather, stalled supply chains, shipping, disease, heat stress. And the sea ice for me is kind of interesting because there's actually a direct linear correlation between emissions and the loss of sea ice. So we can measure really strongly a cause and effect, which has been kind of fun to go and talk with high emitters and actually be able to pinpoint their contributions, which we know from remote sensing and satellite data, regardless of what they say that their contributions are and what their emissions are, we actually know we have a really good idea of what they are, and we're actually able to pinpoint their contributions and the direct planetary impacts through things such as that linear relationship. I just got a multi-million-dollar grant to look at how these polar tipping points are affecting global health, especially in places like Africa and Asia, where there's already a lot of health stress. So looking at, for example, nutrition and food security, water security, sanitation, vector-borne diseases like dengue and malaria, because we're seeing that these connections are really global and that they're not understood, not modeled, but stand to have significant global impact. So here's just an interactive of a project that I've been working on that just shows a series of recent global disasters around the world. And if this were live, it would, if you were to view this live, it pings up with what those actual connections are and how these global systems interact, and especially focusing on the role of the Arctic in driving these systems. Probably many of you are familiar with the idea of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are a series of 17 goals and 169 targets. So this is my modified, artistically sort of icy version of their standard diagram right there. But these are to create a more sustainable world by 2030 by reducing poverty and enshrining sustainability in all different forms. So this involves tackling food and water security, poverty, gender equality, education, ocean health, infrastructure, etc. We're halfway to 2030 as of this year. These were set in 2015. progress on almost all of these has stalled. Some of them has even actually regressed. But each of these goals is not actually achievable without preservation of seemingly disconnected aspects, such as the health of the polar regions. So my interest is really looking at how the loss of Arctic sea ice, for example, has direct consequences on gender equality and education around the world. And a bit of what I get to do in this sense is take the role of the Arctic in its influence on global stability, climate stability, and global risks that are associated with its warming to global decision makers. So heads of state, business CEOs, et cetera, including with organizations such as at the UN and the World Economic Forum. So that's a little bit about why the Arctic is especially interesting to me. So I'll just talk a little bit about my research. So to the Arctic. This is a photograph by Donald Macmillan taken in 1909 as part of the Peary Macmillan-Henson Arctic expedition. This was from the Peary Macmillan Arctic Museum at Bowdoin College, titled North Pole Party Crossing a Lead. So a lead is a gap in sea ice of open ocean that one needs to cross. So you can see that there's a team of probably about 6 people at this point in their expedition and a group of dogs. They ended up taking 240 dogs with them. So I can't imagine what that boat looked like with 240 dogs. But this expedition's been really fun for me. Not only did it inspire some of my early interests, as a kindergartner in the polar regions, but between 1909 and now, many things have changed, but many things have actually really stayed the same. So for example, my first day on my last expedition last year, I was struggling with my stove and I just couldn't get it to heat enough to produce enough heat to boil water. I could get it to melt snow into water, mostly water, but I was having to put it in my sleeping bag to get it to a possible temperature to drink with me in the sleeping bag. And, I wanted to put a hot water bottle in the sleeping bag to keep me warm, not use my body heat to warm my water. Eating dehydrated food that was just gritty and sandy because I couldn't get that. And the rest of my team was, having a great fun time laughing at me. And I spent, 3 days just in tears and cold and miserable. And it wasn't until other people's stoves started failing within that first week that we realized that actually it wasn't the stove that was the issue. It wasn't me that was the issue, which was really reassuring, but it was actually our fuel, and that we had poor quality fuel for where we were. So that was frustrating to discover, but it gave us solutions. But it also, going back to this expedition, once they got off the schooner and they got onto the ice, Macmillan found that his stove also didn't work. And they couldn't figure out why it had worked on the boat. And it turned out that they didn't have fuel, that they were using an alcohol fuel, and it actually couldn't ignite in the colder temperatures. So there were some fun little things like that, similar struggles. Something very different, didn't carry dogs, didn't take dogs. I haven't never gone with dogs, generally carry all my own stuff. So this expedition that I'm going to be, my next one that I'm going to be doing, I'm carrying a sled of about 300 pounds. So, and there are, of course, lots of differences, not just similarities, but this is a screenshot from a presentation that I did last year. So last year, this last expedition, 2022, I set off with about 5 men to retrace an expedition, Swedish expedition, to be the first to the North Pole. It's about 36 years before Macmillan, Peary, and Henson and their Inuit leaders were credited with getting there. So sea ice is actually quite blocky and chunky, and it requires a whole lot of athleticism and time to get across it. And when you're doing that with dogs and sledges, it can be sort of a very much impossible task. And that's what the Swedish expedition led by Arvid Nordenskjöld had discovered. So they actually failed to reach the North Pole because there was too much sea ice. As you can imagine, we didn't exactly have that problem. So here's a talk that I did at the Stockholm 50 conference last year, which was the 50th anniversary of the first global climate talk. But I'll get back to this point in a minute, or this image in a minute. So in fact, on this expedition, we ended up having to reroute ourselves 6 times due to extreme weather and lack of sea ice, so climate related issues. So, you know, getting to a point realizing that the leads are too big, you actually can't cross that part of the sea ice, and the water's moving too quickly to try to kayak with our sledges. And also glacier surges. So glacier surges contribute to what's one of the most dangerous polar and more broadly alpine phenomena, and that's crevasses. Despite our use of the metaphor of something moving at glacial pace to mean very slowly, glaciers can actually move quite quickly. They're effectively rivers of ice. The average glacier around the world might move about 10 inches a day, but they can get into what's called surge. And that is often when they get lubricated from underneath and the glacier basically loses contact or loses the support of its base, and it will slide. These can accelerate the glacier up to maybe 100 times of its average pace. So what this can look like in the nice world is that you pitch your tent on a glacier and you wake up, you know, a kilometer downstream. But in reality, it pulls the ice apart. And this can expose big crevasses where can, you know, miles down of gaps in the ice. And that's particularly dangerous. What's especially scary about these is that especially at the beginning of the melt season, they're still covered by snow. So you don't actually see the crevasses because of these snow bridges. So when the snow is solid enough, it's perfectly fine. You can ski across them. You don't really worry about it. But as that snow starts to melt, we start to lose that support of the snow. So it becomes really imperative to read the ice, read the snow, to try to figure out what is going on underneath the snow where we can. We would always, when pitching a camp or stopping for food or anything, keeping our skis on, because that just disperses weight so much more, and really staying on skis until we were 100% certain that the ground we were on was perfectly fine and did not have crevasses underneath it. We did on one night, one guy and I pitched our tent. We were all set. We checked everything out. He'd gone off to do some research on measurements. I'd gone off to do something, came back, spent some time in the tent, and he jumped out of the tent and stepped right into a crevasse. And we just hadn't, you know, we hadn't noticed it despite having, you know, been in and out and checked it. So luckily he only got one leg in and we were able to get him out without much issue at all. This is just going back to that earlier image. So right, you can see on the left of the screen that building. It's this spot again. This is a spot known as Pullheim, and it's on the very northern tip of Svalbard. And it's where the Swedish Nordenskiöld expedition of 1872 used as their base of embarkment to get to the North Pole. It's a driftwood, small material, or driftwood and floaty material house. It was built on land where the crew had actually built themselves a shelter. They had sailed up. And this is a rebuild from their 100-year anniversary. So this was about 50 years old. But it marked sort of our ceremonial start to our North Pole expedition as well. However, that previous expedition had actually spent 2 years locked in on their boats here, frozen in the ships, with the ships being frozen in. As you possibly can guess, we didn't also have that same issue. And I was walking right down to the water and actually taking water samples. But there, you know, it wasn't just water samples. The water had a lot of stuff in it. Another reason that I think the poles excite me is that they are really essential to our global atmospheric and oceanic circulation systems. So things that get in the atmosphere often end up in the poles, or they get in the ocean circulation systems. So I was finding plastics. I mean, this is some nylon fishing line. I just reached down and picked up, you know, a couple 100 miles from the nearest person or the nearest fishing area of fishing, 1,000 miles from the nearest city. Plus, some of these plastics are nano microplastics that are getting in the fish flesh or killing a lot of the fulmar birds. About 90% of fulmar birds in northern Svalbard are dying from plastic ingestion, either from starvation or from strangulation. And we also are having black carbon, for example, from ships. Most of the black carbon right now that we're having from the Arctic actually is coming from Asia, and it can transport very quickly through the atmosphere in, you know, a matter of 4 days to a week or two. So it's pretty pretty impactful. And there it can obviously magnify global heating by both melting snow by being black and absorbing more heat. But it's all not all doom and gloom. This was a fun little discovery for me and completely took me by surprise. So this is a picture I took of Eric, who's a glaciologist with me for scale. But this is a tree. It's got its root system there. And I was not expecting to see trees at 80 degrees north. And this is some of this right in the sea ice, some of it right on land. But right where I am here is, between sort of Russia and Europe. So through species identification and dendrochronology, we can understand pretty well, looking at these trees that we're finding, about the past half millennium of sea ice and currents. So we can really retrace a lot of historical climate patterns as well. So many of these trees in this area particularly, we were seeing spruce and pine from the Yukon Basin at the time of the Industrial Revolution, but elsewhere, larch from Russia, trees from the 1600s. So that to me was really, really kind of fun. And one of the fingerprints of the climate crisis globally is extreme weather. And as you can probably imagine, in an area that's very remote, very open, no trees except for the driftwood, we can get a lot of really good extreme weather in the Arctic. So here I am about to have a meal in a snow cave that we had built. So when we had tents that could sustain about a Category 1 hurricane, so we're looking at sort of 70 to 75 miles per hour, anything above that, our tents would not be able to withstand. And it was not a pleasant experience being in a tent. It sounds a little bit like you can imagine putting a washing machine on with sneakers in it or something. It sounds a little bit like everything's bashing around or you're in a jet engine. And the tents need to be aligned directly with the wind. So if the wind shifts during the storm, you have to shift the tent a bit. And building these walls around the tent to deflect the wind and the heaviest of the snow. So when the wind gets heavier or stronger than 70, 75 miles per hour, we end up having to bury ourselves in the snow. So this is one example of a type of snow cave. And snow caves are very bizarre feelings because they're completely quiet and generally once closed off dark, even though it can be light, especially in the Arctic summer. So you can see we have a little roof window in there that we closed off after we were finished building. And this held 5 of us in here. It held 6 of us officially, but claustrophobia. We weren't all keen on sleeping it. We made 2. And we would take a sled that we had and we would put it against the wall. So the wall, if you can kind of think of sort of a standard, what you might think of as an igloo design with a door that goes down and then entrance is sort of up. So your living quarters are up, and that's just so that the heat can rise and the cold air sinks. So you have this little door that you're crawling through, and we'll block it off with the sled, and then you have shovels inside because it will all get blown in and you'll have to dig your way out. So that was kind of certainly an adventure. And one of my big concerns was how to keep the polar bears out when I was hiding in the snow, because seals hide in the snow and they love seals. Turned out that didn't need to be something I needed to worry about just location wise, but it was definitely a curiosity. And we weathered some storms in our tents as well. So here you can see how we've used our skis as tent stakes. And the only reason that these aren't really covered more in is that we built snow walls, which help deflect the snow. So you can kind of see behind the 2 tents, there's a little bit of an echo of a snow wall there. And so again, these needed to be rebuilt constantly, and we'd have to get out to keep as much snow off the tents as possible. So we did some research too. So here's a picture of Eric doing some science. We were measuring glaciers here. And this was in conjunction with the University of Uppsala, a project that they were doing. So this also shows an image of one of the sleds. So we each had a sled like that. He has some solar panels strapped to the top of his. And you can again notice that he's still on his skis. Again, just safety precautions for the crevasses in the territory. So one of the fun things for me is sharing a bit about going into these regions and what I'm finding, especially being in this part of the Arctic, which warming about 7 times faster than the rest of the world, the Arctic in general about 4 times faster. So we're really seeing changes that are happening now. And I mean, at one point, for example, one person I was with had a camera strapped to his chest and he wanted to stop to take a picture. And it was, we were told, no, you don't actually have time to take a picture, even though it's already strapped to your chest, lens cap off, because we're not going to get across this glacial river that started to have an outburst flood. So things are happening, immediately. And so being able to communicate that, what we're seeing, it's not research that's happening 3 years ago. This is sort of happening right now. So the pictures on the left, on the left, are calling into an event at the World Economic Forum. And the ones on the right doing some podcasts, doing some Instagram lives, doing some various interactive videos. And then there's certainly some similarities to older expeditions. For me, fitness being one. I mean, Shackleton had a fitness expert on board his ship to just make sure that the crew stayed in the physical condition he wanted. For me, my primary form of training is pulling tires. I'm often in the woods around my house and open roads with a couple truck tires. I've named them, so they're kind of personal to me. But these 2 truck tires weigh about 130 pounds combined. I can fill them with various weights and various things to make them a bit heavier, a bit lighter. And my first experience pulling tires, I went downtown Freeport, and the police pulled me over after about 5 minutes to say that I don't actually have to pull the tires. I can just call the police and they can drive me to wherever my car is broken down. So that sort of put me off doing this in public for a while. So I stuck to the closed roads, but I've gotten back into doing it in town a little bit. It's fun. And it's a fun way to engage people because you look a little bit awkward pulling tires around town. Riflery is another super important skill. Not that one would ever want to have to shoot a bear. Absolutely, the last defense possible out of numerous ones, but it's a very important skill, especially because other earlier defenses, such as a tripwire, so an electric fence around a campsite, for example, can short circuit in the cold and actually are very unlikely to scare a bear away anyway, but are more just to alert you that a bear is in your camp. And these tripwires are maybe a meter outside of a tent. So they're, if they're tripped, a bear is right there. They also can be hard to hear with the snow just because of such its insulating properties. So that's, so having flares, having various options is really just beneficial. The best option, of course, is to just get away and not interact with the bear at all. Polar bears, especially in the regions where I've done a lot, have never seen a person before. So they don't associate us with food. They don't think that we have food with us. They don't smell that and associate it with anything, which means that unlike camping, for example, in the western part of the United States, where you might want to put your food well away from your tent and maybe up in a tree, I can go to bed with a sausage under my pillow if I wanted to, and it wouldn't attract a bear. So we don't have those concerns, but they are curious and they are hungry. So sometimes they will get a little bit wandering around to try to figure out what's going on and whether maybe there is some food. So seals are generally, as I mentioned, with the hiding in the snow, seals are generally their favorite form of food, their favorite meal, and seals are mostly found along the coast. So that means that their behavior and location can be relatively predictable for an unpredictable animal. Thus, when bad weather strikes, for example, and you're near the shore, you have a sort of the safer choice is to either go inland or go out to sea, because the bears are unlikely to be in one of those locations. Although certainly not out of the question, because they are expanding their food, et cetera, especially as the seals get harder to find and as there's less sea ice that can support their weight. So getting away from a bear, seeing one and basically packing up and moving on is usually the best situation. That said, moving a team of sledges, especially in poor weather and up a glacier, is a very slow process. You might only move a kilometer, maybe even maybe 2 kilometers an hour at best. So next spring, I am looking forward to my next expedition. I'm off to Greenland for what I hope will be the first or close to first net zero or first, zero carbon expedition. So we're planning a 1,000 kilometer trek and conducting research on things such as greenhouse gas leakage from underneath the ice caps, and doing some education projects with students who are designing their own research projects that look at either cold environments, ice structure, human interaction, although there won't be humans in this part of Greenland, but physiology, for example. And then working with them to conduct those experiments and being able to test them with them. And another thing that I will especially looking forward to, perhaps pushing my luck a bit, testing out some new cooking fuels and ways of heating water that does not produce greenhouse gases. So I think I will leave it at that. It's just under half an hour, and it's told to aim for half an hour. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll open it to any discussions or questions.
Thank you so much, Susana. The call to action for this week is a simple one. It's, if you have social media, follow Susana on social media. She is an amazing follow, and just somebody you want to engage with. And so thank you, Susana, for putting that up. And then also please consider supporting Susana in her research. If you know of a person or an organization that helps fund research expeditions, mention her work and reach out to Susana. Her email is up on the screen, and we will include that in the follow-up email for today as well. We have so many great questions. Please keep them coming in. And there's a couple of themes here that I want to touch on. Susana, as the host, I have my host prerogative here, which is I get the first question for myself, and so I have to know, what are the names of the truck tires?
Yes. So the names of the truck tires. So the first one that I had is Rolled Amundsen. So that's rolled, ROLLED, because of the tire, obviously. And it is a former functional tire. It no longer was a functional tire. I got it from a local farm. So it had rolled. So there's also that past tense part. And it would be nicer if it did roll. So Roald Amundsen is the first one. The second one, that is the one that I put right behind Roald, is R.F. Scott. So that's after Robert Falcon Scott, who was racing Roald Amundsen to be the first to the South Pole. And that one earned its name because when I would go out in the winter with these two, they would get on the ice and they would gain some speed, and they would both battle for the position right behind me. And inevitably, they'd both hit me in the back of my knees and I'd fall over. So that became their little race. So I had Roald and Scott. And then the third one, tried various ways to give it a name or figure out a name, and it never really earned one, but it was kind of always in the way because I didn't always take it out. It would be in my barn. It would be in the outside. It was kind of on the, so it just became the third wheel.
Okay. That's fantastic. We have a lot of questions here about your kind of training regimes, and I know you mentioned, we have the tires. You become a crack shot, it seems, but you are also, your background is a competitive athlete, and so
yes.
Can you speak more to that background? And as you're thinking about the training, what's the similarities? How is it different? And is everybody else that you're going with also, I guess, the same level of fitness as a former collegiate rower?
So certainly I think rowing as a background was really helpful for me because it was, a lot of training where I would go out for hours at a time by myself in a single scull and row. And, rowing, you're sort of seeking for that perfect stroke. And a lot of time in my head thoughts, rowing is a sport that's generally quite painful. And so dealing with that physical pain, dealing with the sort of got to buckle down and just get to the end, I think was really helpful, just that mental training. And I rowed at the elite level for about a decade. So just having that day in, day out, several times a day was really great to be able to go out and pull tires, sometimes not seeing anything, maybe the person ahead of me for 10 hours a day. And I can definitely tell you that I was seeing faces in the snow. I was hallucinating. I was mic'd up for part of it and realizing that I am telling myself weird stories on the microphone that everybody can hear afterward. So I think that was really important to me. The 5 other people I'm planning to go with to Greenland are all ultra marathoners, and I stand out from that because I am not. So they have that physical fitness. I think that's just sort of a precondition in some ways. It's also not just the physical fitness to be able to go on for something 10 hours a day every day. It's, you know, it's different from a marathon. For example, you're not trying to get through something to get through it and get a certain time. You're training to not just do one marathon, but to do one every day. And so injury prevention, for example, is a big aspect of the fitness. It's so that your body, your muscles, your joints can sustain 10 hours a day for several months needed.
So I think to answer some of the questions from people in here is not all of us are going to be going on these expeditions, so we have to live vicariously through the I'd say the quite fit amongst us. So thank you, Susana, for that. We had another one, which is what are some challenges that are unique to the trip to Greenland, and how are you kind of approaching that differently than your past trips?
So trip to Greenland is unique in several ways. One is that we don't have there are a couple pretty common routes across Greenland, but they tend to be across more southern parts of Greenland, not where we're going. So we don't actually have a route that we are following that people have done before. So that means we don't know too much about where the crevasses are. We don't know what the conditions are like. I mean, we have good ideas. We have satellite data. People are doing research on Greenland all the time, but to really understand what is it like to ski across that, it's going to be a little bit of a surprise.
How do you go about planning a net zero expedition? What does that look like? And I guess in particular, what does it mean to get there, to get to Greenland from here?
Yeah, so no, that's a great question, and that's certainly something that we're battling with quite a lot. So I ended up actually writing a book, or co-writing a book, a year ago, 2 years ago, on reducing emissions in Arctic research. And so there are a lot of things from food sources. I mean, you know, just my interest, for example, I wanted to, you know, I like eating vegan food, but if I were to go vegan on an expedition, I have to carry twice as much food. So, you know, lots of discussions on, is it worth me trying to be that much stronger so that I can carry that much more food? Or what does that mean? So, you know, those are a little bit easier on I guess this upcoming expedition, we're sort of all looking at those kind of questions. Around my last one, it's like, well, if you want to be vegan, you can carry extra food. So, but working with organizations, I mean, there's a lot of technologies that we haven't really implemented or, you know, need to be tested. So would be actually going and doing some of that testing. Then you get into questions about the actual transport and how does that work? And, you know, I think in it, there's a little bit of a difference between, I guess, you know, they're not going to be zero emissions completely, but zero emissions that we cause. So that would be like, I'm not going to fly there, for example, but I could take a boat, but I'm only going to take a boat that is, you know, a sailboat that is going there anyway. I mean, there's certain boats that go up and down the coast a little bit. So doing that, but there's been some research done especially in Antarctica on some zero carbon technologies and expeditions, and working with manufacturers to make sure that clothing is certain materials so that it's not just, you know, Gore-Tex that's creating PFAS, more PFAS in these regions. And that's with the standard materials in some of these places. So really trying to look at all angles.
Fascinating. We had a couple questions here about your kind of academic background, and my synthesis of the questions is your degrees don't necessarily scream polar scientist to me. how did you choose anthropology and linguistics? You were a Rhodes Scholar, if my memory serves right. You've done all these
Yeah.
things. You must have a thread in your head. Show us the thread that got you to the different places that you're now preparing for a trip to Greenland.
Yeah. Okay. So backstory to when I was 4, I decided I wanted to be an astrophysicist and I was going to get my PhD in theoretical astrophysics. And half my
As
family
4-year-olds are wont to do. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Half my family thought that was great. Half my family thought that was the worst idea possibly imaginable. And so my grandmother in particular said to me that that was a really bad idea. Plus, all astrophysicists are Russian, so I'd have to learn Russian anyway. So again, being 4, it's like, all right, I got to be a Russian-speaking theoretical astrophysicist. So I, yeah, pursued astrophysics. I pursued Russian. I got to college doing both of those, and then ended up actually getting quite ill, and I couldn't complete the astrophysics, but I could complete the Russian that I was doing. And I was really interested in language and how we were using language to talk about nature, to talk about science, to communicate, to work with, especially I was doing some stuff with indigenous communities in Brazil and actually back in the Arctic as well, on how they're using language to identify, or sorry, to assert identity, politicization, language policies, etc. And so that really actually got me interested in language, and that then turned back onto the science. So I did a master's in linguistics, and my research was all done in northern communities in the high Arctic, looking at political language identity and policy and how they were using language to assert their identities and navigate relationships with other states.
Cool. Switching topics a little bit, we had a couple questions about COP28, and as we approach that, what progress are you most hopeful about, and how would you like to see the conversations around sustainable development goals change there?
That's
Real
a can
swerve.
of
Yep.
worms. So COP28 is hard. COP27 was hard. And, you know, I think it's hard for me when we know that emissions, for example, fossil fuels are so much of the challenge. And, you know, fossil fuels didn't even make it into the Paris Agreement as a topic. We talk about reducing emissions. We talk about net zero, but we're still talking about net zero as something in the future, you know, plans for net zero in 2050 or 2060. And that idea is enabling us to maintain the sort of status quo. We can continue to emit because in 30 years, we'll have some amazing technology. And, you know, yes, we're getting some technologies. We've got some, but not fully at scale. But, you know, some of these carbon capture plants that we're advertising, and, you know, this is a topic that came up at COP27 last year in some session that I was at about, you know, oh, well, we don't have to worry about cutting fossil fuels because we have these amazing carbon capture. And you actually get into it, they don't say any of this in those discussions. We get into it, and like, that carbon capture plant you're talking about is 38% effective, which means it actually emits more to run than it sucks and sequesters from the atmosphere. So I think there's just a lot of that for me is very challenging. And I'd like to think that we could cut past that, because, you know, everybody who needs to know knows that there's a lot of that manipulation going on. So I think I'd like to figure out how we can cut past that. Will be interesting to see on the loss and damages front, because that was something that was pushed through last year, pushed through possibly questionably at the expense of what, and was not discussed. It was going to be discussed this year. So it sort of felt like it was pushing the ball down the table a little bit. So we'll see how that goes.
Cool. We had a couple questions about whether or not you ever work in warmer climates, and is that something in the future? You're one of those original slides there was a bunch of climate tipping point spots. Are you just you know, exclusively cold weather, or do you ever work in warmer climates?
Well, I love anything below about 40 degrees. Anything above that, I start to melt. Uh, I do have a passion for marine biology. I do love fish. I enjoyed a week after COP last year in Egypt. I went diving on the Red Sea. And actually, every morning, my hotel was right on the Red Sea. And every morning I went snorkeling. And it was lovely to be in warm water and see some tropical fish. And I love that. I don't know that I could be in warm climates and not be in the water because I just overheat. So maybe some drier climates without the humidity, but
Okay.
no, I don't know. I've loved the cold and I've always loved winter and I love skiing. And I think that that's another thing that drew me to the Arctic as well. It was a place of theoretically endless winter.
How long do these expeditions take to plan? I mean, you've described you're getting ready for one next spring. I mean, how often are you going in them? And when you're thinking about them, what does a time frame like lead up look like for an average trip?
Yeah. So this current one is probably about 2 years of planning, maybe
Wow.
2 to 3 years. And still certainly in the fundraising and kind of at that point of like, if I don't, I have to have a go, no go call fairly soon, which is going to be based on the funding. But, there's permits that need to be approved. There's, in the case of Greenland, need to have a rescue plan pre-approved, need to have logistics, anything if material needs to be shipped, for example, especially if you're going to do it in a low carbon, no carbon manner, that all needs to be approved. I mean, it's a lot easier to get something on somebody's boat if they're sailing there anyway before they go than after they've gone. So, and even shipping by plane can take weeks, if not months, to get something there. To make sure that all of the equipment is field tested, everybody has the training that they need to have. Sprucing up on fitness, which takes time to develop. Making sure that the team has the right people and the right skills that are represented, and that the team members all get along and are all happily together, even if they're stuck in a tent for weeks at a time. So lots of goes into that.
The rescue plan caused a number of messages to come in, and I think there are people. I'd like to know more about the permits, but that's just because apparently I'm a lawyer and I can't get rid of that in my brain. So I'm going to ask, what are the permits like and what are they for? But most people here want to know what the rescue plan looks like and how do you plan a rescue plan and how's that shaping up?
So still working on the one for Greenland, so I can't speak about that one too much. But I mean, last year I ended up having to actually get rescued off of the sea ice and I had a little unit where I could text. Garmin sent me a little text unit so I could keep in touch with people. And I did actually every day we sent latitude and longitude coordinates as to where we were, and everything was fine or everything not fine. We had about 50 characters that we could text at a time, and it would go whenever next got satellite connections, so hopefully that day, sometimes sooner, but you couldn't really have a back and forth text too much. But we also brought a radio, sort of a standard marine radio as well, and could hop on channel 16 and see if anybody was around to answer. And actually that we had arranged when we realized we were going to have to get off the sea ice because it was just melting too quickly. And, I'm there in skis up to my knees in water and just sloshing along. And we had something planned for the next day to get met by a ship, and that had been all sorted. And then we came across a spot where we thought we would have decent chance of getting some help, it'd be a convenient spot to get some help. So we hopped on the radio, and a boat from Norway was sailing nearby and answered and said that they could be there in a while. And we couldn't see them at the time; they weren't going to be there immediately. But a couple hours later, we were able to meet up with them right on the ice and got hauled on board.
Thank goodness for Channel 16. Yeah.
I know.
I think maybe we don't think we covered this, but there's some questions about do you work for an organization or is this an independent thing? How do you structure the work and all the different projects you do, the books and everything else? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. So I am science manager for Arctic Basecamp, which is a nonprofit based in the Netherlands. And it was really designed to shape a lot of, well, science communication, but shape a lot of Arctic science into effective policy. So I head up a science team and team of global risk experts from around the world. And those are people who are anything from economists to heat stress specialists, global food systems people, glaciologists, atmospheric scientists, and really synthesize a lot of that and then bring that into policy. And I also do a lot on my own as well. So applying for grants and conducting research. So
Cool. You mentioned that you'll be working with students in Greenland. Are they students from Greenland? And how'd you get connected with them?
yes and no. So some from Greenland, some from Maine, and from all over. My big interest is connecting students with meaningful impacts. So, and making sure that they feel that they can really make contributions. So one for me was to connect with students I know, or schools that I know or have some connection to. So reached out to a bunch of schools in Maine, for example. Haven't reached out to everybody yet, so still open. So if you have a school in mind, let me know. And other ones that have reached out to me elsewhere in the States, a few abroad, and doing using schools. Some schools have specifically ask for research connections as well. So I've been able to be in touch with schools that have put out on certain web pages that they're particularly interested in such and such, and they kind of ask for scientists to reach out to them to sort of match up a little bit. So there's a little bit of that as well. But some certainly from Greenland, because it's for me really important to engage local populations wherever I am, even though in Greenland, I might be 1,000 miles away from where the students are and where the only parts of Greenland are populated, but still it's their territory. So yeah, and just sort of whatever is interesting to them, let them learn a little bit about why I think this region is particularly important, particularly valuable. And also what do they want to contribute? They have research projects they want to design, and they can be really simple things. How does ice freeze in a certain way? Or, how does the salinity of sea ice change as it freezes and as it becomes maybe new sea ice versus multi-year sea ice? And that's affecting ecosystems and all sorts of ocean circulation systems. So, giving them that chance and then conducting experiments with them and for them. And we have these systems through Zoom effectively and YouTube where we can have live audiences weekly, and you can record things, and you can have up to, a couple thousand students at a time watching live, not interacting live. You might have a Zoom session of maybe it's just a classroom or maybe it's a couple classrooms, and then but a couple thousand people actually watching live as well. And so it sort of gives you that scope to engage with individual students, but also very broadly. Many students interested in certain topics. So cool. And then hopefully working with them afterward as well as, here was your project and what did we
Absolutely discover? We have a question. What's the craziest trash or plastic that you found in the Arctic polar regions considering ocean circulation?
A doll head. I mean,
a doll head.
That was probably the creepiest.
Yeah, I don't like that. No. Okay.
But it's fun because you'll find, I don't want to say it's fun, but there's pieces the size of me and it's stamped on it exactly what it is and where it's from. Some of this you can really track serial numbers. There's a lot of really amazing data that you can get from all of this.
Sure. You described a lot of physical preparation for your trips, and I'm wondering about the mental preparation. Does Arctic Basecamp have, a staff of psychologists? Do you take a sports psychologist or a psychologist along on these trips to kind of get you through the hallucinations and the like? What does the mental side of this look like?
Nope. The mental side is no, I think that comes with the physical side. I think the physical preparation is really the mental preparation as well, as being able to just go for hours at a time and deal with the hallucinations, deal with the not being able to sleep and the sleeplessness, dealing with being cold when you're cold. Sometimes I find that even though I have theoretically appropriate clothing, I get sick and I can't get warm or whatever and feel really cold. The picture of me at I had on the last slide of my face with the white, the frost in my hair. That was probably the day I was the coldest on my last exped. I don't know, I was absolutely miserable. I was getting frostbite on my face. I had frostbite on my hands. Every 10 minutes we had to stop so I could stick my hands in somebody's armpits to warm my hands up, because there was literally no other, there was no other way for me to warm them up. And, you know, the day before my hands had been perfectly fine and maybe moderately warm gloves. So for me, that was probably the hardest day on that for me. And that was the mental side too, of, you know, because when you get into that position, it feels like it's never going to end too. So just being able to push through that. But I think the big way for me to do that is to, you know, train incrementally. And that's where, you know, the 15 years of rowing several times a day, where it's just like, just got to get through it one stroke at a time. I do sometimes keep a watch at least accessible so that I can monitor time, knowing, you know, when I'm going to have another break. So it just helps break it up a little bit.
But if there is a, you know, say an affluent sports psychologist who is also an ultra marathoner and is ready to go on an expedition, they should reach out.
Yeah, let me know.
Okay, cool. So if anybody knows one of them, that's great. The last question I have for you, Susana, is just what's inspiring you? Who's inspiring you? What's inspiring you? What's out there that you're drawing a lot of, I guess, sustenance from?
Boy, so I think there's positive and negative inspirations. And, you know, negative, for example, meaning that, you know, out in the Arctic, we're seeing so many changes and it's not affecting the people who immediately live there necessarily. It's not affecting us here. I mean, we're certainly directly affected, but the people who are most affected are those, of course, who can't afford it, can least afford it. You know, we're seeing Greenland, for example, it's contributing the most in global sea level rise. If Greenland ice sheet were to melt, that's 25 feet of sea level rise. We've destabilized enough as to have already committed at least 10 inches of sea level rise, even if we were to have already cut emissions completely. And that 10 inches isn't going to be universally equal. It's going to be mostly impacting the areas, again, where sea level rise is already disastrous. So we're seeing people who are migrating. We're seeing countries who are figuring out how they have to move the entire country. We're seeing crop devastation, saltwater intrusion, land erosion. And so I think that is sort of this urgency for me that kind of keeps the fire going. So I don't know that that's the most positive inspiration, but it's certainly a big one for me. But I don't know, I've really gotten to have a lot of friends in the polar community. I think it's an area where there's a lot of supportive people and a lot of really fun people. And it's a great group of people to be around, and I enjoy it. And yeah, I don't know that I have specific, I guess there's probably some people who certainly have inspired me, but I think for me, for right now, for polar stuff, it's really just sort of the sense of urgency and the fact that I feel I can do something about it. You know, I can go into these expeditions. I have the ability to do so. And that is sort of a calling as well, that I feel like I need to.
Well said. Susana, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure being in conversation with you. And so the call to action again is just follow Susana. You know, if you have the ability to help out with funding the program, reach out to Susana. But thank you again for joining us. We will be back in 2 weeks. We will be off next Friday for a program called What's Up with the Weather. Feels like a nice little tie-in for today. Examining extremes of the past year and how they relate to climate change with Dr. Sean Burkle, who's Maine State climatologist. So we've got a couple of amazing, inspiring PhDs for you here in October with Dr. Susana Hancock and soon to be Dr. Sean Burkle. So Susana, thank you again so much. And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks.
Thank you. And I use a lot of Dr. Burkle's work in my research, so it's kind of a fun connection. I did just get a message to me about showing a slide again, so I might do that quickly.
Sure.
Is the slide at the beginning, so I think I know which one that is, but if it's not the right slide, just let me know and I can share a different one. I'm just going to run through this quickly. So I think it's this slide, but if I'm wrong, please let me know.
And this is something that I think Maggie can correct me if I'm wrong, but we can also include this image in the email.
Absolutely.
Yes, I can definitely do that.
All right.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.